Welcome to Paranormal UK Radio, created by Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson. Twin Souls is hosted by myself, Philip, along with my twin brother Ronald Kinsella, in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network. A warm welcome to all our listeners. Our next guest, who previously appeared on our show last month, needs no introduction. Andrew Johnson is an author and researcher and is very much a part of the Truth Seekers movement. He has appeared on radio and TV in documentaries relating to the paranormal, along with subjects such as 9/11, the secret space program, the Starchild skull, and free energy. Hi, Andrew. Delighted to have you back with us.
Thanks for inviting me back.
That's wonderful. And as I'll remind our listeners that last month you were talking about 9/11, which we found most interesting. And I know you've got something lined up for today's discussion, and perhaps you'd like to tell the listeners what that is about.
Certainly. Well, again, thank you for inviting me back, and thank you for having me on last month to talk about something which a lot of people find difficult to sort of swallow, really, for various, for some fairly obvious reasons. And yes, indeed, it's a difficult subject. But tonight, I think it will be perhaps a little bit easier in some ways, because I think we'd sort of discussed and decided that we were going to talk about this thing called the Starchild skull.
Oh, yes.
And I feel a little bit kind of awkward talking about this in many ways, because I'm quite open about this. I essentially have stolen most of this research from another person. I mean, that's how I would describe it. Other people, I don't know, maybe appropriated is better. I don't know, but that's I'll set the context to why I say that, perhaps as by way of introduction almost.
Yeah, sure.
And I think because when we met at Mena's house, I think we did speak about this Starchild skull, didn't we? Or perhaps you've seen. Yes, and I think because there was a time when I was with Ben Emlyn Jones, and we did a short interview about it then. And since that point, actually, I had been to the paranormal meetup group at High Wycombe, and I'd given this presentation there about the Starchild skull. And how I came to be involved was actually through a person that I essentially ended up stealing this most of this information from, which was Lloyd Pye.
Yes.
And essentially, though I've used the word stolen, and I sort of had a little bit of sort of a humorous sort of angle on that. It's
borrowed,
really quite well, indeed, but it's really quite sad, because Lloyd Pye died of cancer in 2013. And some people think that because of the nature of the research that he was doing, that this was not entirely a kind of natural thing. Now, I don't know myself. I mean, when Lloyd, this was brought up to Lloyd before his tragic death, and he basically made a case that he thought that this cancer had arisen from an illness that he'd had, which was a serious tooth infection. Because sometimes that can trigger other conditions, as you probably know.
Yes, yeah.
But whatever happened, it was a tragic loss, and he was after he was diagnosed. He didn't have much time left. But it was fortunate that this research was essentially preserved, particularly in view of what I might try and get into at the end, which are some recent developments, which are really quite unusual. So just to introduce what the skull is, it is a real bone skull, and it's not a hoax. It's not made out of plaster of Paris or anything like that. It's been seen by 50 different specialists around the world, at a guess, probably more, over a period of about 15 or 16 years, starting in 1999. That's really when the story starts in sort of modern times, because it was given over to Lloyd Pye, who had done a lot of research into Bigfoot, Yeti, hominoids, and these so-called Almas and Ogogwis, which are these different types of pre-humans or alleged to be pre-humans by some scientists, but certain people make arguments that these are not pre-humans at all. They're a separate branch of hominids and hominoids. And this was Lloyd Pye's area of specialism. And in 1999, he was actually contacted by a lady called Melanie Young, who owns the Starchild skull and still owns the Starchild skull now. She lives in El Paso, Texas, with her husband Ray Young, and they had been given this skull apparently by an FBI agent, strangely enough. And
good Lord.
Yes, and this skull was found in a cave in Mexico in about it was 1930 by a 15-year-old girl who was on holiday there. They'd actually been on holiday in the Copper Canyon area of Mexico, which is about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua in Mexico. And I think they went on fairly regular vacation there, apparently. And this young lady was off exploring in an abandoned mine, which was parts of which were in caves. And so she went into this particular cave, and she saw two skeletons sort of buried or half buried in the dirt there. And she saw, I think, an outstretched hand or something, which attracted her to that area of the ground in there. And she dug away, and she dug out some bones and two skulls. And I think she tried to put these in a basket, but then I think she had second thoughts as to what she was going to do with these, because, you know, if you go out from an exploratory trip, and you come back, you know, with a basket of bones and skulls, what are your parents going to say, you know?
Well, yes. not the sort of thing that anyone would bring home to the kitchen table, so to speak.
No.
But what qualities of the skull is it that that differentiates it from our normal skulls?
Well, quite a number. I mean, you know, we'll get on to it in a minute. And
Right.
just to say that what happened, she managed to get the skulls out to cut a long story short, so to speak. And she did get them back with her. There was a human-looking skull and then an unusual-looking one. And she kept them until she died, or near her death, actually, which was in the 1980s. She was getting quite aged by then. I think she was quite unwell. And so she passed the skulls on to another family who didn't like having skulls in the house. So they then passed the skulls on to this other person, this FBI agent, who kept them, but then passed them on to Ray and Melanie Young. And Melanie Young saw this skull, and Melanie Young worked at the time as a neonatal nurse, you know, as a nurse that works with young babies.
Yes.
And looking at the skull, she immediately saw that it was very unusual. And she noticed, for example, that the eye sockets were very different. And the overall shape of the skull was kind of more bulbous. Certainly looking from the front, it had a more bulbous appearance. And looking from the side, again, it's sort of more angled from the side. It's got a sloping back, and it has a number of other unusual deformities, like it has no inion. The inion is this lump of bone that sticks out of the back of your skull. That's not present on this so-called, what became known later as the Starchild skull. The way that these bones are arranged as well, the so-called bones of the skull, I'm trying to think of the names, and Lloyd was very good with these names, and they don't come to mind as easily for me, because I'm not an osteologist or anything like that. But Lloyd, having studied anatomy, he, knew these very well. But basically, you've got the same main bones as in the human skull, and you have what are called these suture lines, which are like these wiggly lines, which for the division between where the bones fuse together.
Yes.
When you, as you know, with a very young child, less than maybe a year old, the
Yes.
skull isn't completely fused, and you have gaps. You have this soft spot called the fontanelle, And then you have these lines, and I don't know how many bones in the skull there are. I think there's at least 3. There's maybe a few more. But there's at least three main ones, and they fuse together at a certain age. I forget the exact age, something like 5 or 6 or 7 years old, something like that. They're fully fused by then.
I mean, we were very privileged to see the very expensive replica of that skull that you have in your possession. And I have to say, even Ronald, that, you know, the composition and the whole structure of that skull is very, very startling in detail, because it does look very much like what people would say is a grey or a grey
an extraterrestrial. We
yes.
will have a picture of this on the actual interview.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Yes, great. Yes, it will be very useful to have that. Obviously, people can put their Starchild skull into their favourite search engine, and no doubt will come up with several links attempting to debunk the skull. But
like everything else,
as they do with
exactly. It's the same story. But this is real physical evidence, and we'll go through more of the differences in a couple of minutes. But how I became aware of this skull was, I'd started looking into this stuff, as I think I said last month, because of the Disclosure Project. So I was looking at revisiting the whole UFO alien topic, extraterrestrial topic, you know, en masse for myself in 2003. And it was, I think, probably late 2003, sometime like that, I first read about the skull. And there was a website called starchildproject.com at that point. And I picked up a lot of information from there, and I ended up writing to Lloyd Pye. And it turned out that he was coming to London, and that actually turned out to be for further tests that were being done on the skull at that time. And he was in London, I think, for a period of several months, staying at the house of a lady called Belinda Mackenzie. And I emailed him, you know, and very friendly chat, very down to earth, no airs and graces. And he said, "Oh, why don't you come and visit me and come and visit me in London?" So I went to see him. And how I initially got to know him was he had a number of his slides that he was using for his talks, because he was giving various talks from time to time, you know, around the place. Yeah. One on the Starchild skull, and one on the hominid and hominoid research that I mentioned earlier. And he had these slides on 35mm, you know, on projector, so you could project them in a projector. Yeah. But he had started to realise that a lot of people were swapping over to using PowerPoint, you know, and PCs and laptops and things. And I'd already started to do that, and I actually had a slide scanner, a transparency scanner, which allowed me to take his slides and put them onto a disk for him, you know, and that's what I did. And he was like, he didn't even know you could do this at the time. You know, he wasn't overly tech savvy.
No, yeah.
And, but I'm a bit of a geek. You know, when push comes to, well, not even when push comes to shove, I'm a geek all the time.
You know your technology.
I try. Well, I'm a tutor in that subject, so I should, shouldn't I?
Definitely.
So anyway, so that's how I got to know him, and he was kind of bowled over, and I think it helped him a little bit at that point with some things, and we stayed in touch for up until when he died, and I organised a couple of talks for him. One that was organised in Nottingham, just about 15 miles from where I live now, in 2009, and then I held another event when he came over to the UK again in 2012, when a lot more research had been done. Mm-hmm. But the research in London ended up being very interesting, what they got from that, and we'll come on to that in a little bit. And also some research was done on the teeth, because they have 3 or 4 teeth that had survived as well, mm-hmm. which is very interesting, because those are good for getting viable DNA from, which is eventually what they were used for. Yeah. But going through some of the other differences, you've got all the sort of major features of the skull, you know, the ear holes, and they're different on the Starchild skull. You've got the things called the pterygoid plates, which is sort of near the cheekbones. They're different. As I said, the eye sockets are different. The nose is different. There are no brow ridges. So where we have these little ridges of bone that stick out underneath our eyebrows, they're not very prominent. They were much more pronounced in earlier sort of humanoid forms.
Yes.
Like the Neanderthal man had very pronounced brow ridges, whereas ours are very, very much reduced.
Yeah.
With the Starchild skull, there are none. There are no brow ridges at all.
That's always interested me, because I've always said very quickly here that that we have modified or evolved, and if we were the true inhabitants of this planet, we would not have to shy from our very own sun.
Yes, I was just going to say, which
Yeah.
may suggest that where it came from, the planet was probably darker. But I mean, it's conjecture, pure conjecture.
Sure. I mean, this is something which Lloyd also talked about. He did talk about that type of thing and the kind of problems, with the official sort of endorsed scientific theory of evolution and all of that.
Yeah, the Sunday school version. Yes.
Yes. There are many problems with that. And so this, of course, comes to the fore when you look at the Starchild, when you start to consider some of these issues, such as the one you've just raised right there.
Yeah.
Certainly going back to the eye sockets, for example, on the human skull, typically an eye socket is 2 inches deep. But with the Starchild skull, it's only 1/2 inch deep. So this is an enormous difference, 1.5 inches difference. It's not just
And also, sorry to interrupt, Andrew, you said also that although the Starchild skull is thinner, it's much stronger and it has more density than our skulls. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's another of the things which is, particularly obvious once you start to, get some of the bone out of the skull, drill some of it out for DNA testing, which is what they did. And you're absolutely right. The Starchild skull bone is, I think, 3 millimeters thick, compared to a human skull, which I think is 9 millimeters thick. I've got the exact figures somewhere here. So this is something that I say it's physical. It's not conjecture. You can hold the original thing in your hand. If you go to El Paso, Texas, and ask Melanie Young to see it, she will hopefully let you see it. And you can hold this. So the bone chemistry is also very different as well. This was tested, I think, in around about 1999. I don't know the date of the test. And for example, it's got more aluminium in the bone, and it's got more oxygen in the compounds that are in the bone. Which is done with a mass spectrometer. And so this bone is actually chemically more similar to collagen, and it's actually more like tooth enamel than it is like human bone.
Yes.
How extraordinary! Right.
So what made this? What genes made this? This is just totally off the charts. And when I mentioned I met Lloyd in 2004, there was a chap in London who was actually a forensic pathologist, who was an expert witness in court about what happened to, bodies and so forth.
Yeah.
And he had been contacted Lloyd. I don't know whether Lloyd contacted him or what the route of contact was, but he also took the skull into his laboratory, and he cut up some of the bone, put it under a scanning electron microscope because he was willing to do that, and they discovered fibers in the bone, which are not seen in any type of mammalian or reptilian bone, to my knowledge, anywhere on Earth. And we've got a number of pictures of these fibers, and we don't know what material these fibers are made of. They're not blood vessels, they're not capillaries or anything like that. They are something different to that. But they are in these pictures, which were taken in 2004, and they've never really been tested. So we've got fibers in the bone, we've got different bone thickness, different eye sockets. If you put the skull into a machine which does a CT scan, you find that the cavity of the inner ear is larger than in a human.
Yeah. I'm so pleased because we can now rule out a deformed child, which people will automatically assume, because the composition is completely different or extraordinarily different from that of human beings. So I'm very pleased to know that the research has been thoroughly done on this skull. It's fascinating.
Yes, a lot of research has been done, but I'll come on to something which happened only earlier this year, which is very strange to say the least. But yes, you're absolutely right. And there are many other differences, which is why I'm talking to you about this now, because if I wasn't so sure of what this is, it's certainly not a human skull, and it's not a member of the human evolutionary line. That much is clear. Now, is it an alien being that came from another planet? Well, of course, that is much more difficult to say with certainty.
Well, yes.
Because there is always this possibility. I mean, Lloyd himself said that, with Bigfoot and all of this, Bigfoot is real and it lives in wilderness areas. It's just that we haven't really encountered it in great numbers. That's why it still seems like a myth to the majority of the population.
Well, like UFOs and everything else, Andrew. So, yes.
Of course, that's why it's in this category.
Yes.
But Lloyd, in his book, Everything You Know Is Wrong, he tells a very interesting story, which I wasn't aware of the panda. Going back 100-odd years, he tells a story of how the panda was discovered, because there were myths, and accounts of pandas for several years, and people in the West believed that this thing was just a myth, it was just a fairy tale. And people described this black and white bear, for heaven's sake, and they ate bamboo shoots. It's the only herbivorous bear that there is. I'm not sure even if it's a bear, but it looks like a bear.
They are cute.
Yeah, of course. And so people thought this is just a child's dream, But then guess what? The first person that caught a live panda was a woman. And they'd been trying to catch this panda for years. They sent well-equipped teams out, but the first person to catch one was a woman. And then they still didn't believe that she could have done it, so she went and caught another one. And people don't know this story, but it's in recorded history.
We soon forget when myth becomes fact. The kind of like magic goes, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I actually didn't know that about the panda.
I didn't know that myself, to be honest with you. But how old is the start? Have they got some type of how old the skull actually is? How old?
Carbon dated.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. That was, I think, one of the quite early tests that was done. And it was carbon dated, 900 years old, plus or minus 40 years. That test has been done twice. It's been done on both skulls, and that's the age. And I think there were mine workings in that area then. There
was some talk also of it probably being some type of hybrid, wasn't there?
Correct. We'll talk about that, because we can lead through the story quite well to get to how that came to.
Andrew, may I just ask, did they find any more of the skeleton, or was it just the skull they found that was survived?
Well, the story that Lloyd was given, and obviously that has been passed on to me and everyone else, was that what happened was, as I say, the girl intended to. She gathered up a lot of bones, but she only came back with the two skulls because she put them into a basket or something, and then she hid the basket in a gully or something, or near a gully or something like that. But then there was and she was intended to go back for it the next day, maybe to take the things back in small stages, under her clothes or something, so she could hide them somewhere and not come back with a big box or a big basket. But what happened was there was an enormous rainstorm, and when she went back, all the smaller bones had washed away. The thing had literally turned into a river, and the only two heavy objects that had remained were the two skulls. And that's what the story was that we got. And we don't. In other words, Lloyd always said that he didn't know if that story was true. That's just the story he was given. But what is not in doubt is the skull that's real. And he used to say as well, if people people would say, oh, well, if you don't know about the provenance, then it's not a valid thing. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's what it is.
It could have fallen out of the sky, as he used to say. The fact is that it's been DNA tested, it's been chemically tested.
Yeah.
You can see the physical deformities, and it doesn't stack up with anything that it should stack up with at all, not even close, as we'll come to.
Yeah.
And like, for example, the teeth, that was one of the first areas of study. And there was a little bit of the maxilla, which is like the underneath of the the top half of the skull. Because as you may know, your jawbone is not actually attached to your skull by a bone. It's just attached by a muscle, so that when all your muscle is withered away when you're dead, the jawbone just falls away, and there's no actual joint or anything between your jawbone and your skull, as was the case with the Starchild. And so they had a little bit of the maxilla that had broken off from the upper part of the skull, and from this they were able to tell some interesting things as well. It looked like the Starchild had no room for a tongue or in its mouth, or it had a very small tongue. And the teeth also showed anomalies in that in the maxilla there were unerupted teeth, which suggested that this was, the teeth that it had were still its milk teeth, which is why they called it the Starchild. But when they looked at the teeth that were on the outside, already, because there are 3 that were on the outside, they had wear on them, so it looked like they'd had quite a lot of wear. So they'd been in use for more years than a child would have used them. So there was conflicting evidence. In other words, from an inspection by Dr. Ted Robinson, there is a report on the Starchild project website by Dr. Ted Robinson, who's an MD, and he's craniofacial specialist. He's specialist in facial bones and that sort of thing. He was a plastic surgeon, I believe. He'd never seen anything like this. He was given this, I think, in like 1999, and he's written this. He's got 18 bullet points here in this report that you can read on the Starchild Project website. He also presented the skull to 10 other or 9 other named experts of various kinds. They agreed that they'd never seen anything like it. They didn't know what had caused these anomalies. And so they couldn't really give an explanation for what it might be. Another thing we didn't mention was the volume of the brain, the cranial capacity on the Starchild. It's I think it's 1600 cc's, but on the human it's 1200. So, and this is all a bit strange because the skull looks a little bit smaller than the human skull.
But it holds a larger content of,
basically more brain mass than us, yes.
Correct. So that there's also another sort of clue, because if you get a human skull, you can reach in through the neck hole and you can feel inside the neck hole the roughness of the inner surface of the skull round the sort of top of the spine area where the neck goes in. I think that's called the basilar part. That is rough inside the human, and I think in the Starchild it's much smoother. And if you look at the morphology of the skull at that point, you can see that the way that the neck muscles attached was completely different to the way that the human muscles attached. So the skull's balance points, where its center of gravity is different to where a human skull is. So this means also the knock-on from that is that if the Starchild had brain like a human brain, it was made of the same sort of tissue and the same consistency of tissue, it would have fallen out of its neck. So in other words, whatever brain was in this skull was different to human brain. It was a different consistency, a different composition. So that stacking up a lot of things here. The other thing that it didn't have was any frontal sinuses. It has no frontal sinuses. And I always ask people when I give this talk, and I think Lloyd did as well, is do they know what frontal sinuses are for? And do you know what frontal sinuses are for in a human being?
Well, is it for smelling?
No.
Is it for breathing or making sure that the sinuses are clear so that there's no congestion?
No, I used to think it was. Some people think it was for warming the air up, and it's actually not for that. It is to create a resonance chamber for your voice, so your sinuses actually assist in your speech, in forming speech sounds and that sort of thing, or giving you a sounding box to make your speech more voluminous. And the Starchild didn't have any, and also it looks like it had little or no tongue.
Yes.
So what might that suggest about its way of communication?
Yes.
Telepathy, yeah.
Possibly so.
Some
possibly
type of psychic link, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I mean, obviously that's speculative,
yes.
but looking at the physical characteristics, that's a possible explanation for them.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So what happened with the DNA testing was sort of that's where it started to go a bit strange, really, because it was given to a DNA testing lab in 1999, and it was called the Bold Lab, and it was at the University of British Columbia, and it was a forensic teaching lab where students performed the majority of the work being done on the skull, and it didn't have expertise in actually handling ancient DNA, which is anything over 50 years old. You have more precise procedures and methodologies for actually recovering that form of DNA. And what actually happened was they produced a report, and they said that they'd got a reliable sample of DNA which was only 200 picograms, so that was a very small amount. But normally, to get a reliable reading, you need 1,000 picograms. So they'd got 5 times less than they needed to get a reliable reading of the DNA. But what they pronounced was that it was a human male child. That's what they said that their DNA test revealed, and that was in 1999. And Lloyd said at that point, that he was basically done for, because this scientific report had said human child, end of, and as he said, they said to him essentially, just put it in the blender, just get rid of it. It's of no interest, Yeah. But he knew, because of all the other factors that I've just gone through and more, which I haven't, he knew from this that he still needed more work done on it. He knew that wasn't the final word. Something had gone wrong. They'd admitted that they hadn't really recovered enough DNA. They weren't experts in ancient DNA.
No, especially something 900 years old. I mean, my goodness.
And you'd expect your top scientists to look at that.
And he said initially in 1999 to Melanie Young, when he saw this and looked at it for half an hour, he said, "Oh, we'll have this sorted out in 6 months. This is so unusual. When I take it to universities, they'll be all over it. They'll be, like a rat up a drain pipe, to use a British expression, and could not believe it. So, he took it around to all these universities. He's actually written a book about that expedition, if you will, or that journey. But that's kind of a bit out of date. You can get the book. It's on Amazon. It's called The Starchild Skull, Genetic Enigma or Human Alien Hybrid. I forget the exact title of the exact subtitle. But as I say, it's a little bit out of date because further DNA testing was done in 2003, which is in the book, in the Lloyd Pye Starchild book. But it's that's been superseded. And the 2003 DNA test, which was funded by a lady called Belinda Mackenzie, who I could talk for a whole hour about probably, that was done by Trace Genetics, 2 chaps called Ripan Marley and Jason Eshelman, sorry.
Yeah.
They did the test in July 2003. And they were testing for 2 types of DNA. Now, as some listeners may be aware, some not, there are 2 types of DNA which you can use, to establish certain truths about you as a person or an animal or whatever. There is nuclear DNA, which, as its name suggests, resides in the cell nucleus, and there is mitochondrial DNA, which sits outside the nucleus in these little kind of like they think that these mitochondria are actually mutated bacteria, which somehow formed a symbiotic relationship with animal cells millions or billions of years ago. And these mitochondria have their own DNA, and I think there's 16,000 base pairs, if I remember. A bit more than 16,000 base pairs. Now, the mitochondrial DNA, that is passed down only from your mother, from the maternal line, whereas the nuclear DNA comes from both parents.
Both parents, that's right.
Right, and you can do separate DNA testing to recover each type of DNA, and you can make certain deductions from each type of test for that DNA. And so in 2003, they had the two skulls there, ready for testing, and the human DNA, they recovered mitochondrial DNA, and guess what? They recovered nuclear DNA as well. And with the Starchild, when they applied the same protocols, well, actually, they couldn't. That's all come to in a minute. But when they actually did recover the Starchild's DNA, they only recovered the mitochondrial DNA. They couldn't recover the nuclear DNA. And what they ended up doing was they put the bone in the normal chemical, which is used to dissolve human bone and recover DNA. And guess what? The Starchild's bone didn't dissolve. They left it for a whole week and it still didn't dissolve.
Good Lord.
So they had to use a different chemical to dissolve it. I forget the precise details. Some of that's in the report, though, which is on the internet. It's not classified or anything. People can find the trace genetics report if they wish to read it. Obviously somewhat technical, but I think it's understandable. So they couldn't recover the nuclear DNA. And so this is where the idea of it being a hybrid came from, because Lloyd had suggested at that point, well, if the mitochondrial DNA was recoverable, that meant that it was more like human DNA. But if the nuclear DNA wasn't recoverable, which was potentially because the dad was an alien, then the mother was human, the dad was an alien, therefore it's a hybrid. That was kind of the logic at that point in 2003.
Yeah, in 2003, yeah, definitely.
Up until, and that changed in 2010. Because Lloyd was doing, many talks around the place, sort of suggesting that as an explanation based on these DNA tests. But then he was contacted in 2010 by an anonymous geneticist who's remained anonymous to this day. Well, I know his first name. I can't remember his second name because Lloyd told me, but he hasn't wanted his name disclosed publicly. That much I do know. And he said, well, look, I'm interested in what you've got, and I think if if it is what you're saying it is, then I'd really like to have a look at it. And I work in a genetics lab here. It's a prestigious company that I work for. I've spoken to them, and they've said that yes, I can do some tests for you. In the back room, on my own time. They said I can use the equipment. So if you'd like to, take me up on the offer, I'd like to have a look at it. And so he worked over a period of a couple of years. I think it ended up being gradually running more and more tests using a new technique. In 2006, a new technique for DNA recovery was perfected by a company called 454 Life Sciences, but it was very good and very powerful, but it was very expensive. If you wanted to do a whole human genome, I think it was something like $3 million or something. It was hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Yeah. And Lloyd had talked about raising that sort of money, but as you and I well know, the sort of field we operate in, people don't operate in it with either with a lot of money. I suppose there's a couple of exceptions.
Unless it benefits the secret military corps, yes.
Correct. And so anyway, this test was commenced, an updated test in 2010, and what the chap was able to do in this lab was he was able to recover the nuclear DNA. So as Lloyd had always suspected, the nuclear DNA was there. It's just that because of the earlier techniques, which use what are called primers, which is a bit like, as I understand it, if you want to find which piece of a jigsaw fits another piece, you could, in theory, sort of take a certain shaped piece of a jigsaw, shove it in the box, and rattle it around, and then pull out your piece in your hand, and then maybe the correct piece of the jigsaw would have latched onto the piece in your hand, and you therefore have a partial match for what you were looking for. And that jigsaw piece that you're holding in the hand, that's a primer.
A rather crude method of genetic coding.
Right. But this new technique, you could literally go directly into the jigsaw piece box and pull out the pieces yourself and straighten them out. And then decode their genetic code, which is basically a sequence of 4 letters, which are different proteins, and then you get sequences. So you get sequences of these 4 proteins. And Lloyd, explains this, and I try to explain this in the talk. That I've essentially, as I say, I took many of his slides so that I could use them in my talks. And you have adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Those are the 4 proteins that make up DNA in this, varying sequences. And it actually is, to use another analogy, it's like an analogy. It's like a digital code. It's like a 4-bit digital code. And that's what makes up all living things. That's what's in all living things. And so what you can then do is, once you can recover sequences, you can see if those sequences of these 4 codes, like ATGC, TAGC, GATC, all these sequences put together, they'll make an almost random looking code. But if you as human beings, we have certain sequences in common with each other. We also have certain sequences of this digital code in common with millipedes and with earthworms and with dogs and cats. So, our DNA is similar to all of those animals, and you can work out a percentage of similarity. And of course, the textbooks will tell you that the creatures that have the DNA which is most similar to us are chimpanzees, which are 98% the same. Which, when you start to think about that, is sort of quite odd, because although chimpanzees have 98% the same DNA as us, they're still very different from us. They look very different. So basically what this gentleman did, the geneticist, is he ended up recovering 200 base pairs. In other words, 200 sets of these sequences of proteins. And then what you can do, of course, nowadays is you get this digital code, this letter code, and I show these slides, and some of them are on the Starchild project website too, because the geneticist, he returned screenshots of what's called the National Institutes for Health database in the US, and they have paid for various genomes to be sequenced of various animals. I think they have about 100 different species of animals where the entire genome has been sequenced to get the complete digital code for that creature or organism, I should say, and they put it in the database. So you can then type in maybe a 200 letter sequence of proteins, and it will tell you what species or animal that matches. And when they did this with the Starchild DNA, some sequences did match, but guess what? Some of them didn't match any species on Earth. So some of the DNA sequences that were recovered were not like anything on Earth. And
that would strengthen the case that it was perhaps some kind of, I'll say it loosely, hybrid. Some kind of hybrid, yes.
Well, or it's just a complete alien, And for example, I've got one slide here where a DNA segment of 342 base pairs didn't match anything in the database, and obviously the longer the match is, if it's human, then it's going to match human, but it's not human, it's not chimpanzee, it doesn't match anything. And what the fellow did is he recovered more and more of the sequences, and I think he ended up recovering what was it in total? It was a few thousand base pairs. I can never remember the exact number, but it was less than 1% of the total genome. What they wanted to do was recover the whole genome, which the way he was doing it would literally have taken years, many years to do it. And so he only recovered a few base pairs at a time, but he did recover one key sequence, and it's for one particular gene. It's called the BOXP2 or the FOXP2 gene, and this is a well-known gene in the human genome, which of course was sequenced a number of years ago, and it's 2,594 base pairs, and in every human on the planet that doesn't have any health issues, major health issues, the FOXP2 gene is exactly the same as everyone else on the planet, every human being. And there are only two differences that you're allowed. One of them causes you to have no speech, and the other, I think, is some other disability that you'd have. If you have more than two, you're dead. You don't survive.
Yeah.
When they recovered the Starchild's FOXP2 gene, it had 56 variations.
Oh my goodness! Good Lord!
So this was completely way off. There's no way that this is human. And in fact, judging by statistics, if you were to scale up the amount of DNA that was recovered and the number of differences that have been found in that recovered DNA to human to the full genome, you're looking at less than 50% similar to human. So considering that the skull has two eyes, a skull that's a passing glance look human if you don't go up close to it.
Well, they did a replica of it, didn't they? They reconstructed it professionally, didn't they, to see what it would look like when it was alive. A very marvelous reproduction of it, and it was quite disturbing.
Well, yes, indeed, and there's some of these have been just done as pieces of artwork, and some were actually done as you're essentially saying there as a physical model, a clay model or whatever, where they build up the various layers. And there's actually been 3 clay models, I think, at least 3 done. You can see them on the Starchild Project website. I think probably the most realistic one is by Bill Munn, which is what Lloyd was showing in his later talks. That was one of the more recent facial reconstructions that was done. But even Bill Munn, what he had to do is he used these model eyeballs, but to get them to fit in the skull, he literally had to cut the eyeballs in half to make it sort of fit into the available space for the reconstruction to look kind of vaguely sensible in terms of the eyes and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, they can't. Sorry, Andrew. They can't even reconstruct the eyes themselves because they have no idea whether they were reptilian or whether they were pure black or humanized. That's one thing that they cannot do.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you stack all these things up, and there's a fair few more I haven't had time to go through. The other thing that I just will mention, though, is this idea that the Starchild was an alien hybrid. What happened, that came from the idea that the mitochondrial DNA was recovered, but the nuclear DNA wasn't. But what this geneticist also did was he re-examined the mitochondrial DNA as well, and similar story to the FOXP2 gene, although there were some sequences that were the same with the mitochondrial DNA, there were many which were not. So even the mitochondrial DNA, he more or less eventually, after a few more tests, said that no, this is not really stacking up with human mitochondrial DNA either. So that's when Lloyd started to move away from this idea of a human-alien hybrid, and there's these breeding programs that some people have seemed to have been part of, depending on which testimonies you sort of hear about. And we've heard these stories of these terrible stories of these fetuses being removed from pregnant women and so forth. Horrible stuff. And Lloyd, of course, had become aware of that through people that contacted him and wondered if that was, factored into the story of the Starchild. But with the later tests, it tended to move away from that scenario, I think, really.
Safe ground, I think.
Basically, he's basically saying that it's a full extraterrestrial. Full alien,
well, that's, I mean, it's not, as I say, we don't know whether it came from another planet, but hey, if we sort of start to put it in the same field as all the other stuff we hear about, then it's becoming more likely.
Yes, because even the tribes of the past, many, we see these on cave paintings, the Egyptians, they speak of people from the stars that visited. So it is well possible, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I just wanted to, probably got a few minutes left, and there's 2 things I wanted to cover to
plenty of time.
this off. The first one being the naysayers and the debunkers, because if you put Starchild's skull into a search engine, you'll probably land on the Wikipedia page, or there's another article written by Frank somebody, and they will claim that this is the skull of a hydrocephalic child.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
the hydrocephaly is where the skull inflates and gives it this slightly bulbous appearance.
Well, that would contradict all the genetic testing they've done. You see, they try and poo-poo it straight away, don't they?
Correct. But not only that, it would contradict the physical evidence from the skull, because with a hydrocephalic child, the individual skull bones that I mentioned earlier don't fuse properly. No. So when the child dies, the skull will fall apart because the bones are not fused together properly. Yeah. So and also the X-rays. I didn't mention that the skull had been X-rayed. I didn't cover that properly. And you can actually see the vein structure within the bone. And this is not something that's visible in a hydrocephalic skull. So it's not hydrocephaly. Right. And the craniofacial plastic surgeon, Ted Robinson, he knew it wasn't hydrocephaly. And the other doctors knew it wasn't hydrocephaly. And the thing is that Melanie Young, who was a neonatal nurse, as I mentioned, she knew it wasn't hydrocephaly. That's what she said. And she said this in a documentary in 2009 for which she was interviewed, in the UFO Hunters documentary. And I'm going to come back to this in a few moments. Yeah. So we know it's not hydrocephaly. The other thing that the debunkers will try and claim that it is progeria, which is this terrible illness which produces premature aging, and it turns very young children into old people, in a very short space of time.
Yes, I've seen that, yeah.
This also causes brittleness of the bones and a unusually shaped chest, and the eye sockets tend to sag down because there's a deformity in the skull and so forth. And there are certain physiological or physical characteristics that seem to match, but then again, you still have sinuses, you still have the human DNA, you still have the same size ear canals and all of this. So the debunkers will just pick one or two characteristics, say, oh yeah, that matches with progeria, so it must be progeria. But of course, we know that the bone is very strong. The bone has been drilled into with a Dremel blade and it bounced off. They had to actually hold it even harder than with a normal human skull. It's very much harder. So that right there rules out progeria and hydrocephaly. Yeah. And if you go onto Wikipedia and you try and edit the entry for the Starchild skull, and anybody that wants to try doing this can try it, of course, it will be put back. It will be changed.
Yeah. No surprise there.
It always completely amazes me that anything to do with the paranormal, with perhaps one of the greatest discoveries on this planet of this child, if it is extraterrestrial, they will not invest money, they will bury it, and they will come up with a quick, and I'm going to say it, cheap explanation. I mean, this could be the absolute sign we need to know that extraterrestrials walked amongst us as human beings on the Earth nearly 1,000 years ago. It always angers me that they have an answer for everything, and yet they'd spend thousands of pounds trawling up a tank buried in mud from Second World War. It just utterly staggers me that anything associated with the paranormal, with UFOs, with extraterrestrials is completely poo-pooed. Yes, we have to be level-headed and, like yourself, academic, but, for goodness sake, there's more to this Earth than meets the eye, and we know that. It's just that you get people who constantly deny it all the time, and as you said, Andrew, they will pick up the first theory by an armchair scientist and say, oh, that's it, that's it, that's the explanation.
That's it. Exactly. And this has been obviously your experience, and it's been my experience too. And it's like there are almost two different types of people on the planet. One is wanting the truth and wants to understand and know and grow to the wider reality, and the others just they have no. In fact, they're against any. They're not only against doing that themselves, they seem to want to stop anybody else doing that for themselves, if you see what I mean.
And
it's an awful situation. And there was an interesting situation that was in the UFO Hunters documentary, which I think is online, the one which has the Starchild skull in it. And I play this clip in the talk that I give because I think it's absolutely key, where they go to a researcher called David Aguilar. Sorry, I'm getting the name mixed up with a pop star. It's David Aguilar is his name.
That's fine.
And he is, he's at Harvard. He's an exobiologist or something, or he likes to talk about the possibility of alien life. And they go and see him, and he talks about, these different types of aliens that might live on other planets, and they might not look anything like humans because there'll be a different atmosphere and a different gravity and blah 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 blah. And then they sat down and they're talking to him, and he says, well, we think we might have evidence of a real live alien. In fact, I missed a key bit out because he says, while he's talking in front of a blackboard, he said, I'd love to get one of these guys in a laboratory and take a look at them, meaning an alien, Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they actually put in his hand the Starchild skull. I think it's one of the replicas. But he looks at it and his face kind of drops and he says, has any DNA testing been done on this? And Bill Burns says to him, we think it might be an alien-human hybrid. Because that was the situation in 2009 because of what I already explained earlier. And this David Aguilar just looks at him and said, prove it. When just a minute before he said, I'd love to get one of these in a laboratory. They could have, he had the opportunity to take that skull into his laboratory, and he ran in the opposite direction.
Yes. Indoctrination.
Or played to a tune, an old tune,
yes.
actually.
Yeah. Or he might lose his job and his funding and his money.
Yeah,
what about that?
Deny everything, that's right.
Correct.
They're all happy to talk about it, but when it comes to the real thing, no, we're not interested.
So I realised, and I'm sure you've realised this yourself, and I don't think I put it into these words myself. I got this from somebody else, but it's the same situation with cancer research, looking for life on Mars, things like the Starchild skull. What happens is NASA is paid to look for life on Mars, but not to find it. Cancer charities are paid to look for a cure to cancer, but not find it.
Find it, that's correct.
Researchers are paid to look into things like the Starchild skull or whatever, sometimes, occasionally, but not find any truth there. So the search it's about the search and keeping the gravy train going. It's not about finding the truth. And the sooner that people understand that, the more quickly they will progress in themselves to get beyond that stage of looking to other people, paying them to do an investigation or whatever.
That's
because
right.
With the establishment, it doesn't work.
No.
Researchers are like Pandora's box. The researchers will open it, they'll find a plague, but we always know that there's hope beyond that plague.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Now, what I did want to mention, because this is also very important in the Starchild skull story, is that something extremely peculiar happened, as I alluded to earlier on, in March this year. Now, I'd sort of seen bits of this coming because I know that there'd been a disagreement among the people that had been dealing with the Starchild skull, which was basically Lloyd Pye, his ex-wife Amy Vickers, and another chap called Matthew Brownstein, who did some lectures himself on the skull about 3 or 4 years ago, and Ray and Melanie Young, who were the owners. I knew that there'd been some disagreement, among them, and what happened was there was a parting of the ways, so to speak, and Amy, who's recently been updating Lloyd's book, Everything You Know Is Wrong, which will be out next month, I think. She advised me of this difficulty within this the Starchild project, as it was called. And now Melanie Young has actually gone to another investigator called Chase Koletsky, who I know from her website has connections to the US military, disclosed connections to the US military. And in April this year, she did an interview with Mel Fabregas on the Veritas show and actually lied about Lloyd Pye and the Starchild skull. And she said he was only in it for the money. She said at the end of it that she thinks now that the skull is that of a hydrocephalic, despite having said the opposite of that in this documentary, which I told you about. Yeah. And to be quite honest, it was really horrible for me to listen to because Lloyd was my friend. Yes. I knew what his objective was with the skull. They both claimed, both Mel Fabregas and Melanie Young, that he was trying to make money out of it, and make $1 million. Yeah, and they basically, to be quite honest, they were flushing 18 years of research down the toilet as far as I could. Now, people might find because I want to tell people the truth. This is the truth of what's happened. I had to write an article about that. It's 6,500 words long. I wrote that all up. So if people hear this story now and think, what's this idiot Andrew Johnson talking about? This skull has now been shown to be that of a human child. But what has now happened is that this skull has been pronounced to be that of a human child. That is the result of the latest so-called investigation done not personally by Chase Kloetsky, but apparently by a team of people that she has assembled over the last year. Yeah. And Melanie Young appears to have endorsed this investigation despite everything that preceded it in the previous, let's see, 15, 16 years, which is extremely unusual in this case because it was Melanie Young that gave the skull to Lloyd Pye in the first place.
That's right.
Yes,
and so something extremely odd has happened.
It's another nail in the coffin for true researchers.
Yes.
It's just like the UFO subject and all the rest, so it doesn't surprise me at all, Andrew.
Welcome to the closure program, which they do with virtually everything.
Yeah.
It does seem like that, and of course, as you and I well know, that they will go after certain people to the point of, frankly, murder.
Yeah. Oh yes.
Yes, so grease the brakes. Yes.
Yes.
Whatever it is, and this is not so much. Maybe that's what did happen to Lloyd Pye. I hate to think that, of course, and as I say, he didn't really think that. But looking at, these interests, as we know, operate over long time periods. They don't operate over the period of an elected official, 5 or 4 years or whatever it is. They're operating over periods of decades or, whole lifetimes or multiple lifetimes, so it would appear. So that is the latest situation. And if people want to read about that particular update, I'll put all the links in. There's links to this interview with Melanie Young. They can go back and listen to earlier talks that she did. For instance, in 2014, Melanie Young did a talk. This was after Lloyd's death. She did a talk probably just about, if you listen to that, you'd think I'd copied this talk tonight from her talk. She was saying exactly the same things. But then suddenly, a year later, the story changed. So, if anybody can tell me what happened, then I'd be happy to hear it.
It's been really great having you on the show, Andrew. And I ask our listeners to do the research, look at Andrew's research, and Andrew's holding the torch up of truth for Lloyd Pye. And
if
we
Andrew
really
could
value.
let us know where people can contact you.
Yeah,
certainly, yes. Well, my website is checktheevidence.com, and there's a contact button on there if you want to use that. I'm on Facebook, as you both know. If they want to just go straight for the Starchild, go to starchildproject.com. Melanie Young's website, if you want to compare the two, that's starchildmelanieyoung.com. If you think I'm trying to, disparage her character or whatever, then, fine, go and check her website out and see what you think. Compare the two, and I think you'll find the comparison quite interesting, and I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And it's really been a great interview. Really loved it. And we're going to have you back on our show again.
Indeed.
For more fascinating subjects and your very vast knowledge of information. We'll suck dry from your cerebral cortex. So thank you very much, Andrew. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both of you. And I appreciate you inviting me on and letting me speak.
It's a pleasure.
Okay. And you've been listening to Paranormal UK Radio, Twin Souls, in association with the Paranormal Network. God bless and good night, and we'll see you next month.